Hi everyone, I'm Olivia Ostneimer, the 2022 Community and Engagement Intern. I've built, launched, and maintained an interactive Twitter community for the Democracy Group. The community started with 0 members, and just 3 months, the community has now grown to 300 plus members. So, let's get started. Throughout this lesson, you will learn how to build a community and about the importance of having a successful community. You should take away strategies to secure a strong community centered around your podcast, and you should have a good idea of how to best interact with your podcast listeners. What makes a community a community? Let's take this question back to the basics, shall we? A community consists of a group of people who share similar interests. A community is also a connection with others as a result of sharing common attitudes, hobbies, and goals. For you all specifically, a community is a space where your audience can interact with you and others who share the similarity of listening to your podcast. You may be wondering why it is significant to have a community for your podcast. Let's talk about it. You have your podcast, you have the topics you're going to discuss down. So what's next? After a podcast is created, it's essential that you find your audience, tap into them, and listen to them in order to produce the best version of your podcast possible. If you have the end goal of maintaining a successful podcast, you need an audience that feels your podcast is in a way homey. By building a community, you are able to communicate and tap into what your audience wants to hear, see, and learn. Your community should be an extension of what's been talked about on your show, as well as a gateway to introduce external sources. A community can bring your podcast many benefits and successes. It can bring you loyal listeners, which is one of the most important aspects of podcast needs. Your podcast exists because of your listeners. A strong, consistent audience equals reoccurring listeners. Another benefit of a community is the ability to keep your audience engaged. I would assume all of you want your listeners to learn more and hear more about the topics being discussed, and a community is another way for them to do so. A community brings a different aspect of engagement. It's more of a private and intimate space. It can also bring an accelerated excitement to your next episode. Those within your community can feel more of a sense of belonging. As a host with your community, you can get insight on different perspectives, improve your understanding of what your audience wants, and learn more about who's listening to your podcast. Tom Ross, a community expert, came up with questions I would encourage each one of you to ask yourself before launching a podcast community. First, you must define your value proposition. What value will your community bring to its members? Then, define your ideal member of your community. For all of you guys, the ideal member will be a supporter of your podcast. And lastly, what feedback are you as a host looking for within this community? When growing a podcast, you definitely want to hear what your community members have to say. Your audience is a great tool to help your podcast grow. Don't be afraid to rely on your listeners for any advice to better your podcast. Let's talk about how to make a community. There are several ways you can go about creating a podcast community, but first you must figure out what platform you'd like to use. It has to be accessible to mostly everyone to get the most out of your community. We'll start with platforms. When building a community, you need a platform that you can send your listeners to. While a lot of platforms cost money to operate, there are some free platforms. Mighty Networks, Tribe, Facebook groups, and Twitter communities are all free. Ultimately, pick a platform that you can navigate easily and one that provides accessible tools for your content and your community. And always remember, a community is more about the people, not the platform. A community can go in several different routes when it comes to content, but try to create content that relates to your podcast. There are several forms of content you can use. When thinking of content, think of easy things people can interact with. People will want to take a 30-minute survey just to feel as if they are part of your community. Posing a question is an easy way to get engagement within your community. It can be as simple as, what's something you learned from a podcast recently? Or a more complex question like, is democracy compatible with economic inequality? Any question will get people thinking, and everyone always wants to share their thoughts and opinions. Polls are another great type of content that people love. Many people find polls fun and thought-provoking. You can easily create polls based on your content discussed during the podcast, or even create a poll that can garner your audience reactions to your most recent episode. You can also ask your audience for topic recommendations. This is directly using your audience's ideas, which will only better your podcast. Other content ideas include bringing a recent guest from your podcast in the community and have community members interact with them, share thought-provoking articles that spike curiosity and conversation, and links to informative case studies relating to topics discussed on the podcast. However, quite possibly the most important point I'd like to make regarding community and content is interact with your community members. This will allow them to get to know you on a more personal level, which will then drive more commitment to listening to your podcast. Always remember to be consistent with your community and the content. Keep the content on topic with your podcasts. If you have a highly engaged community, you will have to remember to stay consistent. Don't ever go MIA on your community. They are your supporters. These are the people that want to hear from you. Don't leave them hanging. A community is a lot of work, but ultimately it can make your podcast improve in so many different ways. Don't forget to promote your community within your podcast episodes. A simple "join our community to get exclusive content" is a great way to promote the private space. Remember to promote the community in every episode, as new listeners will trickle in every episode. I suggest mentioning the community and how to join at the end of every episode. Putting the promotion at the end of the episode is you asking them to do something after you've given them proof and a reason you are worth their time. Link the community in every podcast episode description. The tough part is growing your community. This takes time and you have to be patient. I personally reached out to over 1,000 Twitter users, sending them a link to join the community. Promote your community as much as you can. You have to be somewhat annoying in the beginning stages of building a community. As I mentioned earlier, I created a successful community through Twitter communities with topics focused on the many Democracy Group podcasts, current events, and democracy. You have to hustle to grow a community. I created a concept named the Daily Dose of Democracy. This concept is in the form of a tweet that provides an informative and beneficial piece of information every day, allowing the community members to learn something new and/or have a valuable discussion. These types of concepts get conversations flowing. I also used polls to my advantage, as I found that many of my community members liked them a lot. A lot of your content at the start will be experimental, seeing what your community members will interact with the most. I also used AMAs, also known as Ask Me Anythings. These were great for my community members to get to know the podcast host better. I also did a Fun Fact Friday every Friday. Community members loved this. I found success because I was consistent with content, so post in your community at least a few times a week. Lastly, I want to touch on some other important things to think about. Give your community a name. Everyone wants to belong to something. Set rules. Enforce them from day one. Some examples of some rules to think about are be kind, supportive, no hate speech, no spam or self-promotion, keep content on topic, and people, not companies, meaning you want people in your communities and not an account of a company. As much as you can, reach out to your members one-on-one. Have calls with them, talk to them, get to know the people behind the numbers. They might just have ideas that inspire you and help your community grow in unique ways to your show. Make sure to check out all of the additional resources I provided in the description of this video. They have helped me, and I'm sure they can do the same for you guys. Some of these resources include a link to a Slack group chat focused on building a podcast community, an in-depth video on growing a community from Tom Ross, resources for finding a perfect platform, and some examples of successful communities. Thanks, everyone, and cheers to a successful podcast.